our learners on this fine and slightly windy Monday morning. Today we're going to be thinking about archaeology. We're not going to be thinking about all of archaeology. Archaeology is a wonderful subject which you can spend a lifetime exploring and learning about, and it is also a subject which is constantly changing and updating itself as new objects are found and new ways of analysing and interpreting these objects are found. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a small selection of objects and also some sites where the British Museum has been involved with digging, or where objects from that site have come to the British Museum to be held as part of the national collection. And we're going to be looking specifically at those objects in the ground. And I always say that any object has three parts to its life. An object, part one, is what it was used for originally. How it is made, who then owned it, how it was used. That's what you could call the active part of its life when it's part of its contemporary human community. We then come to the second part of its life, which is where it goes out of active circulation, where it becomes buried to all intents and purposes for our talk today. So it may become part of the archaeological record. It may still be incredibly visible. Archaeological objects such as Stonehenge have never been completely buried, but they did enter a second part of their life where they were no longer part of the cognitive understanding and activity of the communities in Britain who had created them and used them for a couple of thousand years. And then we get to the third part of their life, and these are the objects who have entered the third part of their life at the British Museum. They are objects who have come out of the archaeological record, who have entered the third stage of their life as objects which we can study to find out about the past. So they have been discovered by modern communities. And when we say modern communities, discoveries, of course, going way back into antiquity. There were museums in ancient Mesopotamia. This is not a new interest for human beings. There's very little that's new under the sun, as I'm sure you'll realise after any talk about history or archaeology. But we're going to use a set of objects that are in the third stage of their life at the British Museum, and we are going to ask them to help us understand that second part of their life, when they had gone out of circulation, when they were in the ground, when they were part of the buried archaeological record. And we're going to see what they can tell us. And it's also going to help us to understand a bit about that archaeological record itself. And we're looking at examples from the British Isles. So it will give us information about what does archaeology and excavation look like and involve in the British Isles. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen and bringing up today's PowerPoint. I'm just going to pick up my trusted laser pointer, and we are going to begin our exploration of museum objects and what they can tell us about their buried life. And we're going to begin with a couple of objects made from probably the material that is the material most uncovered by any archaeologist working on an excavation site, I have to say, around the world, not just in Britain, because pottery is usually the most common find on any archaeological site. Now, broken pottery recovered is known as a potsherd or potsherds, and we have an example of this on the left of the screen. Now, pottery is more stable than organic materials such as wood and fabric, and even metals, especially alloys, which have been worked using a mixture of metal alloys. And we're going to find out about some metal objects later in our talk today. And the other useful thing about archaeology and pottery that comes out of an archaeological record is that changes in technique and style over time often make it possible to be very specific about the date and the source of any pottery recovered. And that then helps us to date other objects found in close association with those pottery remains. So we have here a set of potsherds which come from a Bronze Age collared urn. And in case you're wondering what a Bronze Age collared urn looks like, I've popped an example from the British Museum collections here on the right. This is a reconstructed pot urn from Yorkshire, and the sherds on the other side represent a similar Bronze Age collared urn which has not been reconstructed. We can see that a few of the 92 pieces have been pieced together, where experts at the British Museum were able to find a bit like a pottery jigsaw, where there were cracks and breaks that enabled them to confidently put two pieces back together again, but not enough information to reconstruct it in the whole. What we have is a very coarse fabric with large bits of grit in it. If you look at where you have any broken surfaces, this always gives you an excellent indication of the material, the type of pottery that the pot has been made from. So although a pot that you find whole is a wonderful object, broken pieces actually often enable you to interrogate the pot in greater detail, and in particular find out exactly how it was made and what it was made from. And when you have grit mixed in with the clay, as we do with these sherds, you know that first of all you're looking at a type of clay that has been strengthened by adding grit to it, so you end up with a stronger final fired pot. You also know that you are looking at a pot which has been created by hand. There are a few clues to handmade pottery. If we look back at our Yorkshire example, you can see they often have what I think it's quite fair to refer to as a slightly wobbly outline. They're not as consistent or standard as a wheel thrown piece of pottery would be, or a piece of pottery made in a mould. And the other reason that you know you're looking at a handmade pot as soon as you spot grit in the sherds is that obviously if you add grit to clay, if you then think about that being placed on a wheel and spinning at high speed while you use your hands to shape it, the grit would in effect cut into the skin. So gritted clay is not something you want to be using if you are wheel throwing. Ergo, we have here clay that's been used to hand build, either by shaping like a thumb pot or most probably coil the clay and then smooth the outside and the inside and decorate. We can see a small amount of decoration on some of the pot sherds to the left, and the pot on the right gives us a clearer indication of what the overall decoration of a pot would be. And we can see that it is decorated in horizontal bands. It's what we call corded ware. And you can see, particularly if you look at the top there, corded ware comes from the understanding that a piece of cord or thread was wound around the damp clay before it was fired, pulled slightly tight, not to shape the pot, but to slightly dig the cord into the wet surface and leave a threaded design. And we also have additional dotted and scored designs, possibly made sometimes with the human hand, but more probably with small bits of wood, which then make indentations on the wet clay before it is fired. So pottery coming out of the archaeological record gives us a lot of information about the original life of that pot, how it was made, what it might possibly have looked like. If it is able to be reconstructed, as we have with this one, we can then get its overall size. We can start to work out what it might have been used for. And another thing I'd like to point out is that if you go into a museum and you are looking at pottery on display, usually the potsherds such as these will be stored away in drawers behind the scenes, because what the museums like to put out are the best examples of the objects that have been recovered from the archaeological record. The British Museum is no different. We only have about 10% of our entire collection on display at any one time. But you are able to also discover a little bit about the object's life in the museum, because if you look at this example, you can see where pieces have been joined together with a modern resin infill. There you can see an infilled crack being traced down one side of the pot. And the other thing is that although pottery is usually a very stable material in the archaeological record, it tends to stay as it was when it was first buried, you do over time get some loss of pieces, particularly through, say, root movement or animals burrowing through the soil. So if you look carefully at this point, here's a lovely example. Wherever you see what you could call a patch of fabric that has no decoration on it, is a slightly different colour, there's another one just here, that is where, to all intents and purposes, that potsherd has been lost forever, will never be recovered. And so the museum has had to infill with the shape of the potsherd in a modern resin to create the reconstruction. So always interesting to interrogate an object on display in a museum, because again, it tells you a little bit about how it was found. And in this case, how many pieces were actually lifted out of the archaeological record to then be reconstructed at the museum later. Now, occasionally, whole pots are found in undisturbed contexts. Now, one of the ones that you probably would think about are all the beautiful Greek pots that we have on display at the British Museum, the ancient Greek pots. And a lot of these come from tombs. Tombs act as a sealed space with no further interaction after the sealing of the tomb until the arrival of the archaeologists. And very often objects that are in a sealed context, or a sealed built context in particular, will be recovered without much damage. But the pot we're looking at here is an interesting example of a pot which has a very clear life at the museum. So we've got a third stage. Here it is at the British Museum. We know a little bit about its life in the archaeological record, but where it was found in the archaeological record tells us an awful lot about the first bit of its life. This pottery jug dates to the 1200s, and it was found on the Cannon Park estate near Coventry. And it's from what archaeologists call a waster group. Now, within archaeology, the term waster refers to vessels that have been damaged by the firing process and left behind at the site of production. This includes broken pots and whole pots, such as the one we can see on the screen, which have been overfired or perhaps damaged by the explosion of a neighbouring pot or the collapse of the kiln structure itself. Errors that take place earlier in the process, before firing, before drying, and particularly before the final form has been achieved, will usually leave no evidence in the archaeological record, because at that point, the clay is either very damp or only slightly what we call leather dry, as it starts to dry out in the air before firing, which means that it can be recycled. The partly worked clay can be recycled, and therefore there is very poor survival of any unfired clay objects. So this object is very useful, because what it does is it allows us to see a fully formed piece, which, if it hadn't been, in our parlance, a factory second, would have gone into circulation, would have been used, and then might well have been found as potsherds in the archaeological record. There's a few clues as to why this went into being a waster and was part of a waster group dug up near Coventry. You can see that there is a slight sagging on the bottom of the pot. So it has a slightly sagging bottom, which might have meant that it would then have not been suitable for placing on a flat surface such as a table or a domestic context where it would have been used for perhaps serving liquids. We can also see that it has quite poor firing marks on it. These black marks could either be over firing, so the temperature in the kiln got too high and in effect it's burning the surface of the clay. It's also because it would have had a glaze added to it and it looks like the glaze has been overfired, and we can see some very slight traces of the shiny glaze here, which probably would have been a dull yellow or perhaps a green colour. Common glaze is being used at that time, but again the glaze has not adhered well, and in parts that glaze has overfired and gone white. The other reason is down here, where you can see that there what look like gouges in the surface of the clay. Now, it's very unlikely that these gouges would have been formed when the jug was originally being made, because as we've just said, at that point the potter would have had the option to squish their wet clay and either reform it or add it in with some other clay to start again on a completely different set of pots. So it may be that these gouges appeared when the pot was drying and were not noticed before it was put into the kiln. It could be that these gouges were made when the pot was being transferred into the kiln. Perhaps something in the kiln knocked against the damp pot, and again it wasn't seen before the kiln was fired. It seems unlikely that they are cracks made during the firing process itself, because if you have any shrinkage or uneven firing in a kiln, then it is more probable that the whole pot itself would explode, or you would expect to see a large crack which would in effect split the pot into several pieces. But any of these could have been a reason why, when the potter removed the objects from the kiln, they looked at them and they said either A, nobody's going to buy that, not worth me taking that to market, or B, that is not of a standard that even I would want to sell at a lower price. So in effect, waster groups, they've missed out on a lot of the second part of their history because they've never been used, but they tell us an awful lot in the third part of their history in terms of how they come out of the archaeological record. Sticking with pottery, we have another not quite so complete pot. This one, a wide-mouthed pottery jar from the site, the archaeological site of Mucking in Essex. Now, sometimes all the pieces of a pot are found right where it fell and they can be put back together again. Sometimes a pot is placed into the archaeological record whole, or perhaps only broken into a few places, and then pressure and movement in the soil causes further damage, but all the pieces are in effect locked together in the same place for the archaeologists to recover. And this is what we have here. It's early Anglo Saxon, has a flat base, and we can see from this part reconstruction that it originally had a flaring rim, and it's been decorated with bands of stamps, and you can see little circles which have been stamped into the leather dry clay before it is fired. And this one arrived at the British Museum with an accompanying bag of potsherds. And we can see that this is because, although all the pieces of the pot were found together, it was not possible to completely reconstruct it. Some of the potsherds don't fit onto these pieces because the pieces in between are perhaps missing, were not recovered, were too badly damaged, or the remaining pieces are too small to be able to put together in any sensible way. So what we have is a reconstruction, and we can see clearly where pieces that did fit together have been carefully glued together with a reversible adhesive. Sometimes you will see that masking tape is used to hold pieces together, particularly in the early stages of reconstruction. In this case, the masking tapes you can see are just marked with where the pot came from, so it tells us it's from the Muckling site in Essex. But again, because we have broken potsherds being reconstructed, it allows us to look inside the pot, so to speak, and you can see these two little white flecks, little bits of grit. So again, we're looking at a pot which was in all probability coil made, handmade, not thrown on a wheel, where the fibre has been strengthened by adding small bits of grit and stone. And although we're not able to reconstruct the whole rim, the fact that these pieces came out of the archaeological record large enough to be constructed allows us to now, in our heads, imagine what the whole pot would have looked like. So with your eye, you can run an imaginary line around the top of this pot and imagine the complete flared opening, which, although it is wide, the opening at the top would be smaller than the widest part of the pot below. In fact, the whole pot originally must have been really rather beautiful, with these circles running all the way to the top and a beautiful even flared rim around the top of it. So anything that does survive, anything that comes out of the archaeological record in a large enough piece, in a stable enough piece, close enough to an associated piece of that object, and enables reconstruction back at the museum. So how do we find out about these archaeological sites to begin with? How did archaeologists, for example, know that it's worth digging at a site like Muckling? What do they know is under the ground when nothing can be seen above the ground? So we're going to spend a bit of time now talking about some of the ways that buried archaeology shouts out to us nowadays to give us information about what we might find if we excavate. And one of the ways that the landscape and the archaeological record talk to us is through something called crop marks. And this is quite simply where archaeologists use visible marks on the ground to understand the archaeological record underneath. Crop marks are caused by different growth patterns across the field. So, for example, you can see here in our diagram at the top that where you have a layer of stone, perhaps a stone floor, or even the foundations of a stone wall, that buried stone occupies the space of more fertile soil and it affects the crop growth above it. And the crop above it will grow shorter, has less nutrient, less access to water. Conversely, if there was a ditch which has become filled in over time, that buried ditch is usually filled with more organic material than the natural earth, also means that water will collect there and the plants above will grow taller. Where you have objects such as wooden posts, which might be partly decayed, they provide nutrients from the decaying wood, and this is where above you might see not a line in the crop, but perhaps small circles or dots or small mounds. In addition, depending on when you take the photo, if the sun is low on the horizon, then shadows cast by the taller crops will make the crop marks even more visible. And crop marks tend to be particularly notable in very wet and very dry years, when the buried archaeology has a greater impact on the rate of growth of the crop above. So below, we can see an aerial photograph of Beaumont Alts in Essex. And we can see in this field very clearly the outline of a moated domestic building with adjacent walled gardens, We can also see associated trackways and field boundaries. And the site itself has produced finds, so objects, from the late medieval period, pottery and tile. And indeed, a 1599 map shows this site as Beaumont Moats, probably referring to the domestic building that was standing at this time. And that explains the corruption to the modern place name of Beaumont Oats. Now, this photograph was taken in a very dry summer in 1995. And in fact, conditions were so good for aerial photography that year that, as well as revealing the human-made parts of the archaeological record, we also are able to collect some geological information, because you see these thin hexagonal lines, they are not part of human settlement behaviour. They're actually polygon features caused by frost action during the last ice age. So information coming to us from tens of thousands of years ago about geology in the area, and then the more recent medieval human interactions. And of course, we can also see from this aerial photograph modern interactions, where we have the modern road running around the edge of the site. And that might, in all probability, follow the route of a medieval trackway which skirted the medieval Tudor building and has picked up that route and now been tarmacked, probably to create a modern B road. So crop marks provide a lot of information about what is lying underground, but how safe is that archaeological record? And what do objects from that archaeological record tell us about what was going on top of the land in years gone by? Well, we're looking at here an aerial photograph from a site in Aberdeenshire, and this site has been interpreted as a Pictish site from the AD 600s. And archaeology, which is on land cultivated for crops, lies beneath, as you would expect, a worked plough soil. And this is usually said by archaeologists to be the top 20 to 40 centimetres of the soil in any cultivated field. Now, as we've seen, this surface can be beneficial for identifying sites and mapping out past activities by analysing crop marks, or by using processes such as field walking, where people walk across a field and pick up objects brought to the surface through modern ploughing. But this plough zone can also be very destructive for the archaeological remains below. The obvious loss is to standing sites, where ploughing can rapidly remove earthworks, such as burial mounds, and plough attrition, so the action of the plough, the metal cutting part of the plough under the soil, appears to have accelerated from the 1800s onwards, particularly with the introduction of mechanised ploughing and harrowing after World War II. So what can we see on this site here in Aberdeenshire? Well, the site lies in what is currently a pasture field. So we can see that the unexcavated area is laid to grass. But farm records show that the site was ploughed 14 times between 1977 and 1997. So in that period of its life, it was being used as a field for crops. It was probably ploughed before then, but no records were kept. The site itself was scheduled in 2003, so it's currently not allowed to be ploughed. This is an aerial view of one of the trenches cut in 2016 to investigate the site, and we can see the open area of soil, the trench where the archaeologists are working. There are archaeologists. We can see the spoil mounds on either side, and the spoil mound is the soil that has been lifted from the trench. And as you can imagine, the spoil mound is always the opposite way up to the trench. So first of all, you have the grass that's lifted, then the modern soil, and then as you dig further down, as you dig further back in time, so the soil being dug out is then put on top of the mound. You'll also notice that they've followed some very good practice here, because they've put their mounds with quite a gap between the trench and the mound. If you put your mound too near the trench, if you suddenly find something very interesting on the edge of the trench which you want to investigate, you've then got a mound on top of it. So you usually leave a clear margin all the way around the edge of the trench. And we can see that this trench has indeed revealed some archaeological information which would have been visible as crop marks in the past. So we can see that this site was surrounded by two ditches. Here is the line of the inner ditch. And again, if it were to be followed, it will continue around the internal centre where there is greater evidence of human occupation and settlement. It also has an outer ditch, which again mirrors in its curvature the shape of the inner ditch. We also have some examples of the defences. We have wooden post holes, probably showing that there was a wooden fence around in conjunction with the ditches as defence. But what we can also see is extensive plough marks. And these plough marks obviously dating, probably from the 1970s to the 1990 period of arable farming, when modern ploughing meant that the plough went down through the topsoil and was actually cutting into the upper layers of the archaeological record. So these marks have cut across the ground in between the ditches, and also you can see here have cut across the ditches themselves. Now, where you have a very large feature, such as these ditches, which are clearly observable by the fact that they have been backfilled over time, they've naturally silted up, which is why you have a different colour for the earth in the ditches to the surrounding bedrock. Where you have an object that is being struck by a plough, that object will demonstrate plough damage. And here we have an example of this on this polished stone axe. So this polished stone axe has chipping on the surface, and this will have been caused where the stone was struck by the end of the plough and a fragment was chipped off. You can see fragments have been chipped at the top, down the side, and across the bottom. And in addition, you see these brown marks. These are plough marks where the metal of the plough has scraped across the surface, has left an iron residue, which has then rusted. And so when the object arrives in the museum, we can actually see that this was probably lying. It came into the museum with not a huge amount of context. We know it came from Conway in North Wales, and it most probably came from a field. It may indeed itself have been ploughed up at some point, but it also lay in that field for some years and was subject to plough damage. So we were talking earlier about the site at Muckling, and we were having a think about how aerial photographs help you to understand what might lie underneath. And Muckling was a prime example of the use of crop marks, shown on a farm, Walton Hall Farm, where barley growing provided ideal conditions for the development of crop marks, which then led to the discovery of the muck inside itself. The farm is in South Essex, and the crop marks were seen and recorded from the air by Kenneth St John, Director of Aerial Photography at the University of Cambridge in the dry summer of 1959. So this is a very early example of aerial photography, dating from 1959, and clearly demonstrates a dense complex of sites. But the other thing that is also very noticeable is that this site was in the process of being actively consumed, actively destroyed. Because as well as the crops that we can see growing in the fields in the lower part of the photograph, we also see right at the back that this area of Essex is being used for gravel extraction. And a gravel extraction firm have started to work and dig up the topsoil to retrieve the gravel from below. We can see examples in the remaining fields that have not been dug up, where the crops are still growing, of enclosures, a double ditch enclosure here in the centre of the photo, which has in fact, towards the left-hand side, started to be stripped for excavation. So we can see here the pale soil below where the top soil has been removed, and you can follow the line of that enclosure across the excavation trench. But obviously with gravel extraction on the site, this site was not going to be available for much longer. As the gravel was dug out, there would have been total destruction of the archaeological record, which lay above the natural gravel layers, which the gravel company wished to extract, bag, and sell. So a rescue excavation was put in place, the mucking excavation, which was directed by Margaret Jones from 1965 to 1978 on behalf of the Ancient Monuments branch of the Department of the Environment, in cooperation with the gravel company. And it became Britain's largest ever agricultural excavation. The site was excavated all year round, using a shifting workforce of over 5,000 archaeologists and volunteers over its 13-year run. And by 1978, excavation had covered 44 acres and had recorded 44,000 archaeological features, including beaker burials, a Bronze Age hill fort, an Iron Age settlement and cemetery, a Roman villa and cemetery, an Anglo Saxon settlement, 2 large Anglo Saxon cemeteries, and a medieval field system. And from across these occupied areas, the archaeologists recovered 1.7 million finds. And the find is any human-made object lifted from the archaeological record by an archaeologist. So it could be a whole object, say a whole pot, or it could be a pot shirt. Each of those individual items lifted is counted as a find. Only a fraction of this was ever analysed or published in Margaret Jones' lifetime, and the bulk of the post-excavation work occurred later. Indeed, the first volume of a full publication of the site was not published until 2015, by which point the post-excavation phase had cost significantly more than the initial excavation. So what was it that archaeologists were looking for, and what did they find? Well, we've already mentioned all the different phases of occupation that occurred on this site. We know it's a site of human occupation dating from early prehistoric times all the way through to the medieval period, where it had started its life as a farm, which it was at the point in 1959 when it was first photographed from the air. And these crop marks on the farm gave archaeologists an indication of where, when they dug, they would find specific features and where there was likely to be a concentration of finds. So this one is a site known as the South Rings, and it shows a number of Roman and Iron Age enclosures. In the bottom photograph, we can see where one of these Iron Age enclosure complexes is being excavated. So the topsoil has been stripped off. We're looking at the archaeological record directly here in this photo, But let me also point out to you at the bottom, the ever encroaching face of the gravel quarrying, which, as you can see, digs right down through this archaeological record, down to the natural geology below, which contains the gravel that the gravel firm then extract. And we've got some photographs of this actually in action. So here's the gravel extraction. Here is Margaret Jones herself recording some Iron Age features next to a gravel extracting machine. And on one side, we see the processes of industry. And on the other side, we see the processes of archaeology. So you can see, for example, where on the surface, the aerial photograph has demonstrated that there is a ditch, an enclosure ditch, probably around a settlement site. And this is being dug out by the archaeologists. It's got a wooden board running across it so that the archaeologists are able to run their wheelbarrows across the site without the wheels digging in and damaging the surface. We can also see the teams of archaeologists working on these sites, concentrating on particular features that have been uncovered, because this is where you are likely to have the greatest concentration of archaeological finds. Objects are usually found in association with indications of human activity, such as digging a ditch or raising a structure. You can also see here where they have not started work and where those surface changes in colour are indicating that there is a feature below, which will probably be excavated next as the archaeologists work across the site. You can also see where the archaeologists are recording what they find. This archaeologist here has a camera. And also you'll see something that's occurring in a lot of archaeological photographs, the measuring poles. Modern measuring poles are usually red and white, which means they show up in colour and also black and white photographs as differentiated marks across the pole. They are usually marked out in 50 centimetre gaps, so a pole of 2 metres, 50 centimetres, 50 centimetres, 50 centimetres, etc. And of course, if you lay one of those on the ground next to a feature and take a photograph, you can then look at that pole and go, oh yes, that hole that we excavated was 50 centimetres across, because we can see the pole sitting next to it, as you can in this photo, and then read up from the photo to give a rough measurement of the pole in conjunction with any measurement undertaken by archaeologists at the time. So archaeologists should always have a scale in any photograph they take. At the museum, you'll see in a moment some examples of the centimetre scales that we use. And if you don't have a scale to hand, then archaeologists are always advised to pop something like a trowel into a corner of the photo. A coin is another good one, something that has a recognised standard size that can then be used to analyse the measurements in the photograph if you haven't got a ruler or a metre pole to hand. So let's have a look at some of the objects that came out of the archaeological record at Muckling. Here we see two of them. They're both Anglo Saxon, and the first one is an Anglo Saxon iron axe. Now, different materials react differently with the soil that they are buried in. So both of these objects have come from exactly the same type of geology. They've been buried on the same site. They were buried at roughly the same time because they're both Anglo-Saxon, but they have reacted very differently with what archaeologists call the soil matrix, the soil that touches the objects all the way around, 360-degree soil that enfolds the object. So this Anglo-Saxon, early Anglo-Saxon iron axe, we can see it's got a curved blade, it's got a flat back to the blade, tapering down towards where there is some wood remaining in the handle socket. But we can also very clearly see that this axe does not look like how it would have looked when it was being used by the Anglo-Saxons, or indeed how it probably looked when it went into the archaeological record, because it has been subject to what we, would call a huge amount of rusting. And we can see that it's been so badly damaged by rusting that when it was excavated, it was not possible to lift it in one piece. And you can see that it's also been photographed in conjunction with a small bag of fragments, which originally would have been across the surface of the blade, would have been lifted first by the archaeologist before they were then able to lift this part of the blade in one piece. We also have our scaling. Scaling in a museum photograph where there is no scale given, you can take it that these are 1 centimetre squares. So 1 centimetre, 2 centimetre, 3 centimetre, again, so that you're able to then get a rough idea of how big the object is in real life. And any iron object in the ground, given sufficient time, will rust. Because rust is a form of iron oxide. It's usually a reddish brown colour, which is how we recognise it when we look at something metal and it's that colour, we go, oh, it's rusted. And it's actually formed by a reaction of iron and oxygen, which are present in the air or the soil around an iron object. The iron is eventually converted to rust, and surface rust is usually very flaky and friable. Friable is another lovely archaeology word, meaning sort of flaky and soft and not very stable. And indeed, we can see that just with our eye. We don't need a microscope in this case to see the effect that the rust has had on the surface of this iron object. Now, if there are organic materials in contact with the metal, these are sometimes preserved. So if there had been any fabric or leather in contact with this iron axe, it could be preserved either in its original form, where it's encased by the rust, or where it leaves an impression on the rust. And we'll see an example of that later. On the right, in contrast, we have an object which, to our eye, looks very much as it might have looked when it was first being used. It's a glass object, and it's an early Anglo Saxon glass bead, or possibly a spindle whorl, a weight that would have been attached to wool that was being spun to convert it from raw wool into a thread that could then be woven. Now, glass is a processed material, and as such, it survives very well in the archaeological record and retains many of the features which enable its use to be better understood. So because we have whole object, because we can see the shape of that object, the size of that object, because we can see, if we were holding this object in our arm, that it has a slightly curved upper surface and a flat lower surface, that it's got a hole through the middle, a deliberate hole, not a damage hole. There may be a slight bit of damage here to the side. This one in particular that's slightly shiny, that probably indicates that that was excavation damage or possibly plough damage where part of the glass has been chipped. The damage on the other side has a matte patina to it, so may well have been part of damage that occurred when the bead was being fired or when it was drying, possibly where an air bubble came to the surface and left a dent in the final bead. We can also see that it's decorated with white glass slip. And this object, therefore, is talking to us and allowing us to compare it with examples of other objects from other archaeological sites which have the same form, the same size, the same material, and suggesting to us that it was part of textile manufacture, probably in a domestic context, someone spinning wool in the home from local sheep to provide thread, which again would then be would then be woven in the home to produce woolen coarse fabric made into clothes for the population at Muckling. Now, we've said that organic material doesn't always survive very well. And when we say organic material, we're talking about woods, we're talking about fabrics made from wool or made from plants such as linen and cotton. We're also talking about any vegetative material, so plants themselves. We're talking about us, human beings and animals, organic remains. Occasionally, you will find when you go into a museum, examples of organic material which you may be surprised to see, having just heard that organic materials don't survive very well. Organic materials will survive in particular circumstances. We've already talked about how the soil around an object will affect what happens to that object in the second part of its history while it's buried underground, and then has an impact on what the archaeologist is able to recover when they start their excavations. And this is an example of an Anglo Saxon bucket. It's made from wood, and we can see some of the surviving staves of the bucket with the copper alloy bands that would have been wrapped around the wooden staves to hold the bucket in place. We can also see some of the U-shaped binding that would have been placed around the top of the bucket to give it a smooth rim. Now, the metal bit, we know that metal survives quite well. We've already seen an iron axe, which is heavily rusted, but still very much gives us a shape and a form that allows us to understand its original use as a tool, as an axe head. And again, what has survived of this object gives us a lot of clues about its original function as a bucket. The metal on this occasion is a copper alloy. Copper, which has probably been mixed with either tin or zinc to make what we nowadays would call brass or bronze, has been used. And copper is quite a stable metal in the archaeological record. What it usually does is it usually reacts on the surface, which is why copper, exposed to oxygen and moisture, will turn green. And we know when we're out and about, if you see a roof that's very green, you usually know that it's been covered either in moss, or if it's on a big fancy building, then it's probably because that roof was originally covered with a shiny copper coating, which over the years has turned green. And this patina, as we call it, this surface, actually then protects the copper underneath. So copper does not corrode all the way through in the same way that iron does. The patina that develops actually then protects the copper underneath. So we can see that this copper has survived in quite large fragments and has actually protected the wood underneath, which itself will have survived because this part of the site was waterlogged. Organic materials very simply survive in two contexts. One, where it's completely dry, where there is very little moisture in the ground or the air, which is why we have such fantastic organic remains from ancient Egypt, because the archaeological record there is incredibly dry, as well as being undisturbed if we're talking about the tombs, where our mummies are recovered from. But also it will survive if the ground is completely waterlogged. If the ground is completely waterlogged, then it prevents active circulation of oxygen, which is part of the water, and therefore you don't get an interaction and a rotting and a decaying of the organic material. It's as if it's sort of been, it's almost counterintuitive. It's like it's been sealed in the water, and as long as the water doesn't move, everything just is like frozen animation. If that object is then lifted out of its waterlogged situation and starts to interact with the air, it will then start its process of decay. But this wooden bucket in a waterlogged situation is a bit like pressing an archaeological pause button. And a lovely example of this is the Vindolanda tablets at the British Museum, which are wooden tablets from the early Roman period, which were preserved in waterlogged land where you had two stone walls meeting each other in a corner. The water drained down, got trapped by the stone walls, completely waterlogged this area of soil. So when the archaeologists dug down, it was very wet, but the wooden tablets were preserved. As soon as they lifted them and they got them into the air, they could see before their eyes those tablets started to change, the ink started to fade, and they actually had to put them straight back into water to preserve them, a form of a first aid for fines. On the other side, we have another object from Muckling. This time we've got an early Anglo Saxon iron buckle. So we can see where we have the little tang that would have gone through the hole in the original belt. And here we have the loop of the buckle. We can see that the buckle was recovered in fragments because it's quite friable. Our new archaeology word for the day. It's quite delicate, and so as it was being lifted, it was not possible to lift it in one piece. But what's interesting is that you can see that on the back of this part of the buckle, there is textile preserved. If you look very, very carefully, you can actually follow the lines of the weave. It's quite an open, coarse weave, probably from an outer garment that the belt and the buckle were wrapped around, and therefore when this was lifted, this was been lifted from a cemetery site, some of that fabric has been corroded, has been trapped in the rust that has built up on the surface of part of the buckle. The other thing that we can see with this buckle is continuing with this idea of different metals being preserved better than others in the archaeological record. You can see very clearly the circle decoration on this buckle, very similar actually to that circle decoration we saw on the pot. And these have survived because these are inlaid silver. And silver, again, is a very stable material, particularly in its raw and unalloyed state, where it's pure silver, where it hasn't been mixed with another metal. It's very stable, and you can see that although the iron around it is rusting, the silver looks almost as it did in some cases, as it did on the day when it went into the archaeological record on the date of the burial. And you can also see on the other part of the buckle that we have some more copper work. So copper has been used to decorate the face of the buckle. So we have some green patina, which has developed, but also you can see that the copper does not survive as well as the silver. So we're going one step down in the survival stakes. And so the pattern is not quite as clear because you've got a greater level of degradation on the copper than you have on the silver. So just looking at an object and comparing how clearly you can see particular materials that have been used to make that object will tell you something about what the object actually is. Of course, you can then scientifically analyse it to get a definitive answer, but in the field, you can actually lift the object and start to collect some information immediately about what it's made from. And it also tells you something about the materials that were being used by the people who first created that object. And with the bucket, it gives you some information about what the site was like. In this case, around the bucket, very waterlogged, the period from the Anglo Saxon through to the modern excavation period. So objects from Muckling are stored at the British Museum. If you want to see some further mucking objects, and believe me, there are thousands of them, I popped into the chat box the link for the British Museum collections online, and if you put into the search box mucking, M-U-C-K-I-N-G, you will see not only these objects, but lots of other objects from the site. And you've now got a few tools for starting to interrogate these objects, along with the information provided on the database, and start to develop an idea of what they might originally have been used for, what happened to them in the archaeological record, and then how the archaeologists would have found them as they came out of that record to start their modern life in the museum. We're now going to look at another set of objects which are very famous in the museum. This time we're in Norfolk. We remain in East Anglia, and we have gone to an area called Ken Hill, which is a wooden hillside just outside the village of Snettersham in Norfolk. And Ken Hill itself is an area of raised land, which we can see here in its modern incarnation as an archaeological site. So this field, which we also see marked out in the map below, was the site for the discovery of what is known as the Snettersham treasure, a collection of Iron Age objects found between 1948 and 1990. And overall, across that time period, nearly 180 torques, that's a form of neck ring, were recovered, plus over 100 bangles, 170 coins, metal ingots, and other fragmentary pieces of metal. The objects themselves were found as 14 separate hoards, all deposited on purpose by more than one person. And we're able to date the hoards because of the coins that were found with some of the objects. And therefore the hoards as a whole in this field were probably deposited over quite a short period, between 150 and 60 BC. Now, in 1948, the field was ploughed deeper than usual. And this area of land, which had previously been a Norfolk lavender field, was prepared for a crop of barley. So ploughing went deeper into the soil to receive the barley seeds and to enable the growth of the barley roots. And while this was happening, the tractor driver, Raymond Williamson, uncovered an unusual lump of metal. He showed it to the farm foreman, who said it was most probably part of a brass bedstead that had been thrown away on the farmland. And thus, what we know as a gold torque lay for a week by the side of the field. During the continued ploughing, more fragments of metal started to turn up, and these were taken to Norwich Museum, where the curator, Rainbird Clark, confirmed their age and came back to the field to look at the first object, which he confirmed as an Iron Age gold torque. As a consequence, excavations were carried out, and 3 further hoards, hoard A, B, and C, which you can see on the map below, were discovered in the field. Ploughing then continued. The field continued to be used for crop growing, and additional finds were ploughed up in 1950, 1964, 1968, and 1973. And here is an example of an object which came up only 2 years later in 1950. Here we see a farm worker working on the farm, a gentleman called Thomas Rout, who is holding what is nowadays known as the Snettersham Great Torque. And here we see it as it is in the museum on display at the British Museum today. And here we see it in a photograph when it was newly lifted, had just arrived at the museum and been cleaned, in association with the other objects which formed part of what is referred to as Hoard E, because when it was ploughed up, the torque was found together with a bracelet and a broken torque, which were threaded through what are known as the terminals, the end pieces of the torque. There was also a coin found in conjunction with the torque, and this coin allowed it to be dated as having been buried probably around 50 BC. And just to show you that archaeologists love to keep things and love to record everything they find, in the British Museum collection, we also have the soil that was later excavated at the museum from inside the talk itself. So we have some of the soil here in a small glass file, and this was the soil that was taken out of the terminal where there were breaks in the original object, and then over time soil had trickled through these breaks and actually was then inside the Iron Age object and was then excavated back out by the British Museum, and also pieces of the soil which were then kept in small folded envelopes. And I do particularly like the fact that we can tell that these objects came to the British Museum in 1951, because any British Museum number gives you the year it arrived. It arrived in April, 4th month, on the 2nd day, and it was the 5th object to be catalogued that day. And in addition, we have the lovely typewritten labels that were added onto the box before it went into the stores. So before the days of word processing and printed labels. So this box in itself, you could say, is almost becoming an archaeological record and an archaeological object in its own right. We're now going to have a short break, going to have a 10-minute comfort break, and then we're going to come back to look at the second part of the story of Snettisham, when we move from what could be termed casual unintended discovery of objects through the ploughing process into the process of excavation and archaeological recovery across the site and the discovery of additional hoards at Snettisham. I'm going to leave this picture up on screen. Do have a little look at our archaeologist at work. We'll be talking about this later. And also one of the objects, this time it is objects from what it was known as Hoard F. It's a collection of gold and silver objects. See if you can work out which is which. And then this is a photo of a 1990s excavation at Snettisham, where we'll be finding out a little bit about modern archaeological practice and what the archaeological record can tell us. See you in 10 minutes. Hello. Just to say, I've answered a few of the questions that were in the Q&A during the break. We'll have time to answer some more questions later and I can clarify anything, but we're now going to continue with the second part of the talk, where we're going to finish off today by looking at modern archaeology at Snettisham. And we've said that what we have here to the left are some of the objects that came from Hoard F. And Hoard F is a collection of what we call scrap metal. It's thought that it probably was a set of materials that were held by a metal worker who was collecting them and would then recycle them by melting them down. The hoard was buried, presumably for safekeeping, but then never recovered by this metal worker for reasons unknown. It contained in total 600 fragments and some complete pieces. And if you were looking at this during the break, you will see that we have a complete bracelet, and then threaded onto it, we have a number of smaller pieces of scrap metal. This looks like the end of a torque, and we can see where it's been cut here, and then a hole punched through it to thread it onto the bracelet. And I also said that some of these objects were silver. We saw some lovely shiny silver earlier, but here, these objects which look grayer in tone, these are silver objects. Silver is not as inert as gold, and therefore, as we know from silver we wear nowadays and use nowadays, has to be polished because the surface will tarnish. Gold comes out of the ground in almost the same condition as it went into the ground. Now, by the late 1970s, it was assumed that everything at Snettersfield had already been ploughed up. So when Charles Hodder, a metal detectorist, asked permission to metal detect in the field in 1989, permission was granted. He found hoard F. Now, hoard F was found on the 25th of August, 1990. Now, the 25th happened to be the Friday of a bank holiday. There were no local archaeologists available, and Charles Hodder was worried that he shouldn't leave his hole open in case other people came across it and removed the findings. So he decided to dig it himself. As the finder removed the objects, their exact arrangement was not recorded, but as we know, he recovered over 600 pieces from this particular shallow pit dug into the field. This discovery suggested that there were further hoards in the field below the level of the plough, which had been pulling out the previous finds, but now discernible to the improved technology available through a metal detector. So the British Museum launched extensive excavations across the field and revealed 5 further hoards. Now, 3 of the pits, and you can see one of these pits being dug here, 3 of the pits were actually double pits with 2 compartments dug, one on top of the other, suggesting that this was some sort of Iron Age anti-treasure hunter device designed so that anyone digging down would find the upper pit, recover the objects, but hopefully would not think to then dig down into the lower pit underneath where the more precious objects were placed. So we can see here the archaeological record being exposed through excavation. Because these objects were placed in shallow pits, hand dug in the Iron Age period, the surrounding material is what we call the natural. So it does not show signs of human intervention. The human activity is centered around the pit. The fill of the pit, which is the material that would have been put back into the pit to cover it over in Iron Age times, often has a different color, a different texture, a different feel when you are excavating it. And so this archaeologist is excavating down, has revealed one set of talk sitting at the top of the pit, and will then excavate further down, will lift objects on the top, excavate down through the soil to reveal any further objects below, and will keep excavating until they hit what is called the natural, where they know they're not going to find any more objects. They also have with them their trusty spoil bucket, which will then be tipped onto the spoil heaps that we can see around the edge of the exposed excavation area. We can see an unexcavated area immediately behind him, which gives us an idea of how much soil has accumulated above the top of the pits. So this is all modern soil accumulation above the Iron Age surface of the field. And one top tip is if you have a spoil bucket and you're going on your tea break, you always have to empty your spoil bucket onto the spoil heap and turn it upside down before the tea break, just in case, as often happens in Britain, it rains, because the last thing you want is a bucket full of spoil and water, which is even heavier to take across to the spoil tip. It's also a very good tip if you're gardening as well. Always empty your bucket and turn it upside down before you have a coffee. So the objects at Snettisham were dug going down through the modern surface, and you can see in this photograph here that there's a clear indication of the plough soil. Can you see where there is an alignment of the soil in lines? It almost looks as if the soil is arranged in layers, a bit like a layer cake. And this is the mechanical action of the plough over the decades, pulling through and arranging the soil. And then if you go below the plough line, you get into the undisturbed soil, which can now be explored via the metal detector, allowing the archaeologists to then dig down to find the shallow pits. And we have an example here of one of those pits dug out with the collection of talks at the bottom. The British Museum, having started a limited excavation in the 1990s, in autumn 1991, then used a box scraper to remove the plough soil from a further 3 acres at Snettisham to look for any further indication of human interaction with the soil. No further hoards were found, but what they did find was a ditch running all the way around the edge of the hoard site, which looks like it was some sort of enclosure feature, suggesting that perhaps some of the hoards at least had been placed there as votive offerings to the gods, and that the ditch sort of marked out a special area in the landscape that you went into to make gifts to the gods. The thing I'd like to finish with in this photo is that not only can we see where the archaeologists have dug that fill out and dug back to the natural, exposing the shape of the ditch as it would have been in archaeological times, in Iron Age times. We can also see our measuring pole put into the photograph so we can see how wide the ditch is. We also have the numbering. So each feature, each bit of the site dug up will have its own discrete number, so that this can then be tagged in photographs and drawings. But what I particularly like about this is when they dug deeper, they'd got to the bottom of the Iron Age ditch, but the bottom of the fill didn't look like they'd hit the natural. So they carried on digging down to explore a section below, and what they found was that someone else had been there first. And obviously the fill in this ditch was quite easy to dig through compared to the surrounding soil. And what we see at the bottom here is a water drain that has been a land drain that's been put into the field, probably in the 1700s in Georgian times, where they have in effect dug down through this gully, which you can see marked at the bottom of the Iron Age ditch, making use of the slightly easier to work fill, but dug deeper down to lay the land draining pipes, which, although it is more modern than the Iron Age feature, actually lies below it. That's the fascinating thing about archaeology. It's not always what it seems. You'd always think that the new would be above the old, but not in this case. Thank you very much indeed for joining me today. I've answered some of the questions. We have time for a few more questions. And also I would just like to say that the objects that have been featured today are in the British Museum. That includes the first set of fragmentary objects, the 92 potsherds, which from a Bronze Age collared urn, which was found in Yorkshire. So do go onto collections online, and then you can use the search engine, and really it depends which way you want to go into our objects. So you might want to put in potsherd, you might want to look at objects from a particular time period, so you might put in Iron Age. Also remember that where you have very general terms, there are potsherds from around the world. Iron Ages occur at different times in different continents, so there's also further ways that you can refine your search by doing particular periods and particular places, and you can even look for particular people. So I suspect if you put in Charles Hodder, it would bring up all the objects from Hoard F, because that was the particular hoard that he found and excavated. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Catherine. Somebody's asked about the meter pole, the pole with the red and white markings. I think you mentioned it early on. Just for those who have missed it, what was the distance for those?
They're usually 2 meters, and then each of those sections will be 50 centimeters. And the fact it's red and white is because then you can either photograph it in color or in black and white, and red shows up and very dark black colour in black and white photographs. So it doesn't matter whether it's in colour or black and white, you can still see the markings. There's also some very interesting photos from the 1930s of excavation sites where in fact they're using measuring poles, but the measuring poles are quite obviously marked out in imperial, because each of the blocks of colour is slightly different. It's not standard. So what I suspect is that the first bit, say, may be an inch, and then it scales up to a foot, and then it scales up to a yard. So before, a measuring pole might not have standard units on it, but there should be a general understanding in the archaeological community about what the measurement is on that particular measuring pole, so that they can then understand from your photo, even if they've never been to the site, how big that feature or that object is. So we've gone metric. It's all in meters and centimeters nowadays.
Thank you very much. First question, if you can cast your mind back, what was the location of the first set of potsherds seen today?
They were from Flixton in Yorkshire. It's a Bronze Age collared urn pot.
Cool, excellent stuff. Here's a question for somebody. If they wanted to work in a museum or a volunteer, what's the best way of going about doing so?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Yes, of course, because as someone who works in a museum, I work alongside curators, so I'm not in a curatorial department. So within a museum, there are many other types of jobs. So I'm an education person. We also have marketing, we have catering, we have retail. But as well as that, there's also a group of people in the museum who work as volunteers. And volunteering is often a way for people to do one of two things. Either to work with particular objects that they particularly love. So we have volunteers who work for specific departments who say, I would love to work with Greek and Roman objects. Perhaps I have a background in that period of history and I'd like to use my skills to support the museum. The other way, of course, is for work experience, just to find out what it's like to work in a museum, something you can put on your CV. Also a lovely opportunity just to find out about the different opportunities available in the museum, all the different jobs there are. And most museums will have a volunteer programme. So I know that at the British Museum, if you go onto the website and you search for volunteering, there's a whole section on how you can apply to be a volunteer. So local museums, so say a big city museum like Birmingham City Museum and Art Gallery, they'll have a volunteering programme. And what they will usually do is they will usually look at the skills and the passion that the volunteer can offer and then fit that to a particular function within the museum. So you don't ever have to worry, oh, I don't know anything about history. There are so many ways that you can just volunteer and support functions running through a museum or an art gallery. It's something I did before I came officially into museum work. I did some volunteering at my local museum and just really to get the experience and to see how a museum works, so that you've then got things you can talk about at interview. And we also have a lot of retired people who then bring their skills to the museum, and those organisational skills in a museum, sorting out our collections. We have so many millions of objects which have never been completely looked at as much as they perhaps should be. So there's always opportunities to bring something to a museum as a volunteer.
So, another question, how much soil accumulation each year, and can any indication of how long ago to be taken from how deep down something is found?
Very good question, with many answers. Simple answer is no, you can't judge by the depth of the soil how you are going back in time, because, as the first part of the question suggests, it all depends on subsequent accumulation over the ancient ground surface. And that accumulation will be deeper where there is continued occupation. So if, for example, we're thinking about London, Roman London is way down deep in the London archaeological record, because there's never been cessation of occupation in London after the Romans. So you've then got the Anglo Saxon levels, you've got the medieval levels, you've then got the early modern levels through even to modern. And these are usually uncovered when they're doing development and they're digging the basements and the foundations down. And we are talking meters down in London. Accumulation in an urban setting will usually be as buildings either fall down or accumulation of rubbish. It can also be the accumulation of organic material, so anything that is dumped onto the surface at that time then builds up. Nowadays we try to do the opposite. We have landfill, we dig the hole first and then put the rubbish in. In the olden days they did have middens, but also there would be surface accumulation of rubbish. In a countryside setting, you're then going to have accumulation from leaf fall. You're then going to have certain geological factors such as soil creep. My garden is on a very, very slight slope, and I noticed that over time soil creeps down and grass starts to grow over the edge of the patio at the bottom because there is a slight sort of movement towards the bottom of my garden. It's incredibly slow. It's never going to be all covered up in my lifetime. So there's a number of geological, natural seasonal changes and also human interaction which will determine how thick that accumulation is above the ancient surface. On farmland, it can be quite thin, which is indeed why material gets pulled up by ploughing. And also another thing is that if you have a very fixed lower surface, such as a Roman mosaic, very often those are uncovered just with quite a thin layer of soil on top of them, because if no one's reused the Roman villa site and it hasn't been used for farming, then you just get slow natural accumulation of soil as you do everywhere in the world. But it's deeper where humans have been involved because we're messy beings and we leave stuff behind and we pile stuff up and we build on top of other stuff. So go onto Google and look at some images for London archaeology, and meters and meters. In countryside, in rural, somewhere like Silchester, which is a Roman site which wasn't reoccupied, you're talking about centimetres.
Thank you, Katharine. I think that's it for today. Hopefully we'll see you next week. And just one quick thing. The talks are now full, so I'm unable to issue any more enrolment. So hopefully you've got your link for next week, and then we'll see Katharine again. Thank you very much, Katharine.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Have a lovely week, everyone. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.